Thank you all. Apologies for that. I'm playing double duty here. So some brief housekeeping here. We are sponsored, as you may have seen at other times. We have some amazing sponsors that support the work of NOFA and the work of NOFA in general being represented here at the summer conference. The summer conference represents all 7 NOFA chapters, which is all of New England except Maine, where Daniel is, because they have their own MOFCA up there, which we are tight friends with. And also New York and New Jersey have chapters of NOFA. So these are our amazing sponsors. Please check them out, support them. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with them already. Presently, all of us are watching or presenting this session, this workshop session from land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. Please take a moment to find your location on this map and honor those whose land you now occupy. And I will drop this link into the chat so you can play around with this map. It's a fantastic resource. You can click into the map and zoom down, which is really a beautiful resource that's been created. So I'll drop that link in chat for you to explore on your own as well. This is also a CEU qualified session. If you are a certified crop advisor, I will flash this QR code at the end, just in case that applies to you. And if you miss it, send me an email and we'll get you the code. So please enjoy the workshop. I'll hand over the session to Daniel Mays. Thank you for being here, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm still getting used to the whole virtual presentation, so bear with me. Usually I like to get a sense of, who's in the room and gauge your reactions, but here we are in the new world. So yeah, my name is Daniel Mays. I'm going to share my screen. I'm a farmer in, as Jason said, Scarborough, Maine. So yeah, this is a presentation on how we integrate cover crops into our commercial mixed vegetable operation on 3 acres, as Jason said. So we grow really intensively on a small acreage and try to mix in as much cover crop as we can into that. Yeah, a little bit of, I guess, before I get started, if you have questions that are just, urgent, they can't wait till the end, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. Or you could, if they're not quite as urgent, you could type them into the chat box, and then Jason can kind of tabulate those and interrupt me if he feels it's warranted. Otherwise, I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end to answer questions. So maybe just, yeah, stick them in the chat box and we'll get to them when the time is right. Great. So yeah, I have a very similar slide to Jason's here. So I am farming on Wabanaki land, which, yeah, I think it's really important to recognize that we are on stolen land. And when I say we, I mean, white colonizers, settlers from another continent are farming on land that's not ours, and it was not given to us. We did not earn it in any real way. So yeah, agriculture, its history is inseparable from land justice, also inseparable from racial justice, as most of our, again, as white people, inherited ancestral wealth comes from stolen labor as well as stolen land. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, that's something I grapple with, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that as well. Again, there's a link again that Jason gave out, and then a couple places you can, look into taking action steps. So here's where I farm. This is 10 years ago when I purchased the land. This is in southern Maine, just south of Portland. It was just 5 open acres of hayfield and a condemnable house. And yeah, put a lot of work into the buildings over the years, also into the land. And now almost 10 years later, this is thanks to a drone image from one of our CSA members, this is what the fields look like. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's the house and the barn, and we built a new building and, 4 high tunnels and 3 greenhouses. So yeah, we've come a long way in 10 years. And now we're growing on 3 acres, mostly vegetables, but also some herbs and flowers. We're also expanding into more shrubbery and woody perennials, berry bushes and fruit trees that are still young. We have 9 full-time seasonal employees, and we sell through local natural food stores. We have a 200-member CSA. We'll go to one farmer's market, our local town farmer's market, and we have a little on-farm store. So that's sort of what Frith Farm is at a glance, what our markets are and how we run. So yeah, in talking about cover cropping, I think it's important to step back a little bit and talk about just what are the principles that drive how we farm. So I try to see nature as the model. By nature, I mean sort of wild spaces where humans have not inserted themselves too aggressively, because those spaces tend to be the most productive in terms of photosynthesis, in terms of soil health, in terms of ecosystem functioning. Those tend to be the spaces that show us what is possible. So to the extent we can emulate those spaces in our agricultural practices, the more sort of healthy and robust our farms can be. So yeah, looking at what happens to a field if we don't do anything can be a good lesson for how we might try to farm. So yeah, I came up with sort of these 4 principles that I see in nature. I mean, I shouldn't take too much credit at these. Other people talk about similar principles to sort of strive for in farming, and yeah, you can see how cover crops can really feed into all of these. So number 1, maybe the most important, is to maximize photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the only renewable energy source that we have. And I know people love their solar panels, but photosynthesis is like solar panels that grow themselves from the sun's energy. They don't need to be manufactured. So it's just, and the photosynthesis is how soil was created, how soil is created. It's the only way to actually create soil. It's just sort of the root of all terrestrial health. This goes hand in hand with photosynthesis, is increasing biodiversity. Having the more diverse array of plants you have, the more their photosynthesis there will be. Also, just all the benefits of biodiversity creates resilience in the ecosystem. Again, these are all intertwined, so maintaining soil coverage goes hand in hand with maximizing photosynthesis. The more plant cover you have, the more the soil is protected, the more it pumps carbon down into the soil. And then to try to minimize our disturbance of the ecosystem, and especially of the soil. The more we disturb the soil, the more we're emulating natural disasters instead of natural health. So yeah, cover crops can really help us with these sort of 4 goals of soil health and farm health. And these are my primary goals of crop rotation and cover cropping. So I'm going to talk a little bit about crop rotation, since often that's the sort of the holdup with getting cover crops planted is how they fit into the rotation of different vegetable crops. So first off, why do we even care about these principles? They might seem a little abstract when we're just talking about growing vegetables, but they really are, I think, foundational to not just the soil health, farm health, but our health as humans and as communities. So they provide natural fertility, natural resistance to disease and pests. They provide pest control. There are natural predators that will control pests. They provide healthy food. They increase the nutrient density of the food we grow. And they clean our air and water, all the different ecosystem functions, and which result in human health. So when we nurture this web of life that is a farm or any soil-based activity, it in turn nurtures us. Because sometimes we forget it as humans, but we're actually part of this web. So we are literally nurturing ourselves when we nurture the web of soil life. So here's nature as model again. This is our unmowed roadside ditch. If you look at the diversity, the photosynthesis, the soil coverage, like this is the model that nature sets for us where we did nothing at all. So let's try and bring some of those principles into the fields instead of just having sort of bare soil. So yeah, I'm talking about the crop plan, the crop rotation plan. This is maybe shifting gears a little bit, getting more into the details of growing vegetables, and thinking about what crops go where and when, what crops follow what other crops. I sort of boiled that down to 4 sort of considerations for vegetables. One is try to rotate crop families to break pest and disease cycles. So for instance, we allow at least 4 years between allium crops like onions, garlics, leeks, to break soil-borne diseases and pests, to break their life cycle. And also we do distance between our cucurbit successions so that the squash bugs aren't coming up right where they were the last year, for instance. So another consideration is balancing nutrient uptake. So I often think of that as a balance of leaves, fruits, and roots, which are very, very generally correlated with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Because if we grow the same crop in the same place every year, we'll be taking up all the nutrients specific to that crop, which might not be a balanced uptake, and then we're left with excesses and deficiencies. So rotating between, your leaf crops, leafy greens like kale and chard and cabbage and whatnot, and then your fruiting crops like the squash and tomatoes and eggplant, and then root crops, carrots, beets, whatever, will kind of help balance out that nutrient uptake. And then a big one is coming up with successions, combinations of crops that maximize our short growing season here in the north. So really want to minimize empty bed space. Since here in Maine, our last frost is around June 1st. First frost can be late September. It's a pretty compact growing season. Really don't want empty bed space being wasted during that time. Also thinking about, trying to maximize photosynthesis. An empty bed is not that. And then I think about the compatibility of successive crops. So the spacing and bed prep needs of crops that are following each other. And this is important with cover crops too, because some cover crops leave behind a huge amount of residue that you can't necessarily direct seed carrots after, for instance. So thinking about, what's coming down the line is important in deciding what to plant now. And this is a little more specific to no-till growing, which is, we grow entirely without tillage once our beds are established. So if there's a lot of residues, we don't just get to sort of, disc it under and start with a clean slate of tilled soil. We're having to work with those residues and plan accordingly. So yeah, putting those all together, here's sort of a sample 4-year rotation, which integrates some cover crops. And then, so that sort of gets the cover crops in the mix, and then I'll talk about what those, the logistics of actually planting and dealing with those cover crops. And there's lots of photos coming, so I apologize for the word heavy front end of this presentation. So yes, assume we're starting with sod or some sort of overwintered cover crop like winter rye. So in year 1, in the spring, we're gonna knock down and smother that grass, whether it's rye or sod. So I'll talk more about how we do that, but for now, just go with me that we're gonna knock it down and smother it to kill it. We're gonna make sure it's fully dead before we plant anything into it. In the summer, once it's dead, we'll plant some sort of widely spaced fruiting crop. So something like squash or cucumbers, or in the Solanaceae family, like tomatoes or peppers or eggplant. We'll plant that right into the residues of that knocked down cover crop. In the fall, we'll seed a cover crop mix that will winter kill. That means it will die with the cold of winter. That's sort of the advantage of being in the Northeast, is we can use winter to our advantage, and it can terminate cover crops for us. Often termination of cover crops is the reason why people don't experiment with them, because they're sort of scared of, how am I going to get rid of this cover crop, get it to die when I want to plant my next crop. So yeah, winter can do that work for us. We just have to be careful about what species we choose to plant as a cover crop. So in the fall, we'll do a cover crop that winter kills. Year 2, that cover crop will be dead. So we can plant early spring. We can do early brassicas, kale, cabbage, what have you. In the summer, once the brassicas are winding down, we'll plant some root crops, maybe beets or carrots, and then in the fall, those root crops, at least in our latitude, will come out too late to have time to cover crop again. So we'll just mulch those beds for the winter. Remember, we're trying to keep the soil covered at all times. So even ideally in living plants, but if it's too late to have living plants, we can put dead plants on the soil to protect it in the form of a mulch. Year 3, we rake that mulch off the beds to plant early spring salad greens. Maybe throughout the summer, we just keep doing successions of salad greens. And then by the fall, we have time to plant another winter killed cover crop. So cover crop that dies in winter. Then year 4, that cover crop is dead, so we can plant our early onions. And then summer, we harvest the onions. And then fall, we have time to establish an overwintered cover crop, such as winter rye, that then cycles back and we start year 1 over again. So here's sort of a very, very simple 4-year crop rotation that has cover crops built in almost every year. 3 out of 4 years, there's cover crops on these beds. And yeah, I should have said, I will share these slides with Jason afterwards, and he can distribute them. So don't feel like you have to take too many notes. Slideshow will be available. So yeah, part of crop planning, part of what makes crop planning easier is having a layout of the farm that's sort of standardized. So I just wanted to add that as a side note here, that we have 16 plots. Each plot has 12 beds. Each bed is 100 feet long. It's 5 feet on center, bed to bed. So the bed top is about 42 inches. So having these plots makes rotation planning much simpler, seed ordering much simpler. It's all sort of a modular rotation. So yeah, just wanted to say that. And then for crop planning purposes, we also use, I use Google Sheets, so online spreadsheet that I can share with the crew. And yeah, here we have sort of every row of the spreadsheet is a bed, or in this case 2 rows, because we're doing a lot of interplantings. And then every column of the spreadsheet is a week of the season. So we can see at a glance what's happening, you know, time and space for the whole season. So I really like this way of crop planning because it's much more intuitive than just sort of dates and on a, you know, numerical spreadsheet. It's much more visual. And then I use the colors for different plant families to sort of help organize it. So yeah, this is kind of a segue too to think about cover crops. When I think about like what is a cover crop, it's really just a crop that covers the soil in my mind. So it's, you know, that's a very literal definition. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not also a cash crop. Like you might sell your cover crop, and yeah, it has, you know, cash crops can have that same benefit of all those principles of soil care, photosynthesis, soil coverage, adding biodiversity. So really, I see interplanting as a way of cover cropping in a sense. And if you look at this picture, is what this crop plan actually looks like later in the season. So you see we have cherry tomatoes, you know, tomatoes with sweet alyssum in between them, and then we have beets on the shoulder. So that's what this photo is. And you can see our principles of you know, soil care. We have pretty good soil coverage. You don't really see much soil at all. Where you do see brown, it's actually leaf mulch or compost. There's no soil showing. We have pretty good degree of photosynthesis, you know, multiple layers of different photosynthesizing plants, which also add diversity. So yeah, talking about cover crops, we don't need to be confined to like, it's just peas and oats and buckwheat. Cover crop, you know, that mentality of cover cropping can extend to all different plant species. Here's some more combinations. We undersow our kale with parsley as a sort of undersown cover crop. And that's partly because kale is a non-mycorrhizal, so kale doesn't form associations with mycorrhizal fungus in the soil. I won't go too far down that tangent, but you might look up mycorrhizal fungus. It's sort of fungus of the roots, the beneficial fungus that associate with plant roots. But kale doesn't form that connection, so can actually starve out those fungal communities if you just grow brassicas on the soil. So we undersow the kale with parsley that will sort of provide a little solar drip of energy to those fungal communities so they're there for the next crop afterwards. Also, yeah, just added photosynthesis, soil coverage, diversity. So yeah, cash crops can be cover crops too. Here's another example. Here's a cover crop of escarole down the middle of our pepper planting. And these escarole will get harvested very soon, and then that'll leave room for the peppers to grow up and close the canopy. So just, you know, more revenue, but also more photosynthesis, more soil coverage in the early summer before those peppers are big. Again, yeah, some more combinations. Lettuce with carrots in between, carrots with lettuce in between, sort of experimenting. And just, you know, you can look at the soil coverage on there. You really can't see much soil at all. So then, yeah, getting into more traditionally what we think of as cover crops. Here's an interplanting of Brussels sprouts and lettuce mix, and it's planted into the residues of grown in place rye mulch. So I'll talk about how we do that. But all this rye straw here is from a cover crop that we just knocked down right in place and then planted through. So yeah, let's get into the more traditional sense of cover cropping. You know, cover crops tend to be sort of grass legume mixes are sort of the standards. I'll talk about how to diversify them a little bit too. But for simplicity, here are sort of 3 scenarios, and I'll walk through photos of how we deal with all of them. So one would be a fall mix, and we put that where next year's early spring crops are going. So this is going to be a mix that that grows pretty quickly in cool weather. So we up here in our climate, we try to seed it by September 1st at the very latest. And then it grows pretty well in cool weather, but will eventually winter kill. So it's easy to rake off for the early spring plantings the next season. Seeding, we might seed the same mix in the spring, but then we don't have winter to kill it for us. Then we have to terminate it ourselves, and we use tarps, and I'll show how we use that. But yeah, an example of this mix might be like peas and oats is sort of the classic example that farmers use of a winter killed fall or spring cover crop. So then there's the overwintered mix that goes in beds that won't be planted until the next summer. So by planting an overwintering cover crop, we're kind of giving up that early spring planting window. And that's a sacrifice we make for all these reasons that I'm talking about for soil health and in the long term. So these winter rye is the most common example of an overwintered cover crop. I think it's really the workhorse of winter cover crops. It establishes well even when seeded late. So for us, we try to get it in by October 1st. So that gives us a whole extra month the fall before to get it seeded relative to peas and oats. It's an amazing organic matter producer. And then it blooms and is ready to be knocked down toward the end of May or early June for us here. We're in zone 4B. We're actually in a little bit of a frost pocket in southern Maine, so a little colder than other farms around us. So I imagine a little colder than most of you all in Massachusetts or wherever you're calling in from, but maybe not in Western Mass. Anyway, yeah, zone 4B. Ready to be knocked down around June 1st, winter rye. And it creates this nice thick in situ mulch, which just means grown in place mulch for the following season. It also has a allelopathic effect, so that it, as it's growing, it inhibits weed seed germination. So it tends to be pretty good for outcompeting weeds. And then the third example is a summer mix that sort of takes advantage of the heat of summer, when the soil is most active and you can grow some really big, fast-growing, heat-loving crops. So yeah, I'm going to walk through each of these with more photos. So hopefully no one's asleep yet.
Daniel.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I missed this, forgive me, but Priscilla's asking, is that sweet alyssum seeded in or transplanted? Did you answer that already?
I did not, no, so let's go back to that. So the sweet alyssum here was transplanted. Yeah. I find that direct seeded sweet alyssum in the spring anyway, the flea beetles tend to decimate it. So we started in the greenhouse and then transplanted out. But the seed is so cheap too, you could just sort of seed it really thickly and hope that some of it comes up. Yeah, we tend to transplant more than as much as possible because we end up with, the best soil coverage that way. Can make sure the germination is good. So here's our spring or fall mix of peas and oats. Sort of nice. If you're just starting with cover crops, I'd recommend starting with something like peas and oats. It can be very satisfying and easy to manage. It's not going to sort of get out of hand and take over your garden. So this is peas and oats. These were spring seeded. This is probably probably a week into June here. And they are, in full flower and ready to be knocked down. They're about you know, waist high, 4 feet tall or so. So we used to mow them with we have a little BCS walking tractor with a flail mower, and that works really well, you know, chops it all up and leaves the chopped up residues on top of the bed. But it chops it up so finely that I find the residues break down very quickly, which isn't actually what I want. I want that soil coverage. I want that grown in place mulching effect. So then we started experimenting with ways to just sort of get it to lie flat and die, and then we'd, you know, find a way to plant through that residue or rake that residue off into the paths as a mulch there. So one experimental fun thing, I hope this video will play. Here's one technique the crew came up with of rolling the peas and oats. This is sometimes we call what we do human scale farming. So that was sort of the epitome of human scale, I guess, but maybe not super practical. So we came up with another way of doing it, which is I have pictures of that later, actually, of just sort of crimping it with a T-post that 2 people step on, and so I'll show you that later. But or you can try the human roller technique, but I think the consensus was to wear long sleeves so it doesn't scratch you up too much. So then we tarp it for usually just a week is fine if it's sunny. If it's cloudy and cooler, maybe go 2 weeks to ensure that those peas and oats or whatever cover crop is fully killed. Because we can't plant the next crop if the cover crop is still growing. The cover crop will just outcompete, you know, and keep growing, and eventually set seed, which then can become weed problems. So we want to do all this before it sets seeds, and we want to make sure that it dies completely before planting that next crop. So after a week or a little more, we pulled off that tarp, and this is that same patch of peas and oats that is now, you know, a nice pea and oat straw mulch. It's fully dead and can be just raked off into the paths. And these are what those beds look like after we've raked off the mulch into the paths and direct seeded our fall storage crop. I think in this case they were storage radishes, so black Spanish and daikon radishes. So here are the radishes coming up. Again, all we did here was rake off the mulch. There's no other soil prep. There's no tillage. There's no machinery, no equipment, nothing. So this is, I think, scalable down to, you know, a home garden. The radishes come up nicely, and there they are in the fall. And we got.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Before you move on, there's Jane is wondering if there's any other description besides black plastic tarps. And Al asks, did you knock it down before tarping?
Yes. So yeah, the black plastic tarps, sometimes they're called silage tarps. Johnny's Selected Seeds sells them. They're called, black silage tarps. They're 5 or 6 mil thick polyethylene tarps that are black on one side, white on the other. But yeah, available at Johnny's, relatively inexpensive. And then did we knock it down first? Yes. So in that example, we rolled it down with humans playing in the in the grass, but now we use a T-post, which I'll have pictures of later, but we kind of step it down just so that it lays flat and we can drag the tarp on it. Thanks. So yeah, these radishes did super well. We got over 500 pounds per bed of grade A storage radishes. Without any, you know, all we did was buy the cover crop seed and I guess the tarps to make sure they died, but otherwise there's no inputs, no combustion engines, no machinery. So sort of a human scale way of farming. So here's the overwintered mix example. Moving on. So I like crimson clover to go with the rye because the crimson clover flowers about the same time as the rye the next spring. You can kind of see in this photo the rye is in full bloom and the crimson clover is also in full bloom. Crimson clover typically doesn't overwinter in our climate, but I find that when planted with the rye kind of insulates it and it survives more than it would otherwise. So yeah, I'll walk through the steps of how we plant and deal with this. So this is after the onions came out of this plot. We direct seed the cover crop with the earthway seeder here. I assume people are familiar with that, but if not, it's just a very inexpensive way to direct seed plants. Direct seed, put down seed, create a furrow, drop seed in, cover it over, tamp it down, all in a single pass with this little hand-powered machine. So we direct seed it with the earthway. One person has rye seed in there and the other person has clover seed, and we just alternate 12 or 14 rows per bed. So we'll put it down nice and thick. And then we irrigate it like we would any other crop. We weed it like we would any other crop. And this is it coming up. This is that same plot, probably a month later. And you can see the clover in there, the rye, it's nice and thick. Then in the fall, we ran our turkeys over it. I call that turkey on rye. And they sort of fertilize it and mow it down a little bit. Turkeys are really good grazers. So we just leave them on there long enough that they mow it down. And sorry, I thought I had another photo, but they mow it down, we move them on, and then it can still regrow with all that extra added fertility for the next season. So then the next season, it if you've ever seen rye in the spring, it grows like an inch a day. It's just explodes upward, and then this stand was over 6 feet tall by June 1st. We wait till it's really in its full bloom, so sort of stocky. The base of the stalks are starting to brown. And I find that is sort of the peak biomass stage where it really produces a nice mulch. A lot of people make it harder by trying to terminate it earlier when it's in that like lush green stage where it's only maybe 2 or 3 feet tall. Rye can be really hard to terminate at that stage because it's just full of energy and it's still wanting to grow. Once it starts to be in full bloom and gets stocky like this, it kind of wants to die anyway. So knocking it over is relatively simple, and then we just tarp it for a short amount of time to make sure it's dead. So here we're knocking it down with just a board, 2 people stepping on it. We've since upgraded to a T-post. Again, very high tech. Just the T-post we had kicking around. And if you've seen a T-post, it has that, it's T because it has this one blade that's, or one of the edges on the bottom can kind of act as a crimping blade. And with the weight of 2 people stepping in unison, can actually crimp pretty well. But then we still do drag a tarp over it to make sure it's fully dead. If you had a really perfect crimp, you could actually skip the tarping step. But I've always been a little nervous to try that since we don't have a tractor with a big heavy roller crimper, which I think you'd need to really have peace of mind in that you've fully crimped the crop. But this does a pretty good job crimping, and then the tarp finishes it off. I've experimented with a piece of angle iron on a snowshoe. That was sort of fun, but doesn't work as well, I find. Kind of have to, with the, angle iron as you walk down the bed. So yeah, I like the T-post. It's also kind of fun to like have to have two people work in perfect unison, because if your timing is off, it doesn't work as well. So yeah, one little comment is make sure to knock it all down in the same direction. So kind of work like a typewriter, and then come back and knock the next bed down the same way, so that when you drag that tarp on, you're not trying to go against the grain and pulling the rye back up as you drag the tarp on. And you want to tarp it right after you knock it down, because the rye will slowly creep back up and right itself. It kind of wants to keep growing even if you crimp it pretty well. So yeah, then we drag the tarp on. Again, this is, the polyethylene silage tarp. And we secure it with concrete blocks. We get the half blocks, so they're 8 inches by 8 inches by 8 inches. They weigh about 16 pounds each, so that's kind of a nice balance, a nice weight to move around without being too heavy to move. But they stack really nicely on a pallet, and they don't degrade in the sun like sandbags. So yeah, I'm a big fan of concrete blocks. We secure the perimeter really well and worry less about the middle, because if the wind can't get up under the tarp, then the middle's not going to matter. And yeah, just noting here, these were those same peas and oats from earlier that were seeded, early spring, so April 23rd. So I guess, yeah, not super early, but that's often as early as we can seed things here. And look how tall they are. They're maybe just calf high. They're just a foot high. And this rye, we already knocked down this rye that was over 6 feet tall and full, that huge amount of biomass. So you really see the difference between an overwintered cover crop and how much that's feeding the soil relative to saying, well, why don't I just wait till spring and I'll plant a cover crop then? There's a huge difference in protecting the soil, feeding it through the winter. That rye stays green all winter long. It's photosynthesizing even as it's mostly dormant. And then it comes out of the gates, in March, and is just a huge amount of photosynthesis and feeding of the soil. So yeah, I'm a big fan of, once you get comfortable with your peas and oats, graduate on to rye, winter rye, and clovers or vetch, because that's really protecting and feeding the soils through the winter is a big plus relative to just during the growing season. So yeah, here's a side note on managing these big tarps. If you're just a home scale, you could probably have small tarps and not worry about this, but for larger farms, we do a full layer of concrete blocks. That's 30 blocks, and then we put a 24 by 100 foot tarp on top of the blocks, and all of that sits on a pallet. The blocks keep the tarp away from the tractor forks, so we can move that pallet around as needed, because these tarps can get very heavy, especially when they're wet. And 30 blocks times 16 pounds a block, that's a lot of weight to be moving around. So then we pull off the tarps after they've been on there, usually about 10 days, depending on the weather. The hotter it is, the shorter you can leave the tarps on. And that rye is now this beautiful straw mulch, fully killed. So we have these pre-mulched beds just ready to accept our transplants. So then planting into this is a little more challenging. I'll be upfront about that. It's not like transplanting into nice, fluffy, tilled up soil. But I find that extra effort during planting time is well worth it, because then the beds are pre-mulched and the soil is full of all the rye roots, which will be breaking down and releasing nutrients to the plants. And there's just zero soil disturbance. So the weed pressure, after doing this for a while, without tilling, the weed pressure goes down goes down pretty fast if you're able to not let new weed seed drop on top of the soil. So yeah, we transplanted through there using a measuring tape to make sure we have the right spacing. And yeah, you can't really use a rolling dibble to mark the spacing since it wouldn't show up with the straw mulch. We've also used a broad fork turned parallel to the bed, and the tines are every 4 inches, so you can kind of use that and wiggle it, and then use that as 4-inch, 8-inch, or 12-inch spacing. And that helps kind of loosen some of the roots, because the rye root mass is intense. You know, there's a huge amount of biomass. So planting into that can be a little tough, but if you loosen it with that broad fork first, it can mark the spacing and create a transplant hole all at once. So this is what the seedlings looked like probably just a week later or so once they're established. And yeah, remember the soil is covered and undisturbed this whole time, with nothing imported. Like, we didn't bring in this mulch. All we did was buy the cover crop seed and put it down. Nature did the rest. And here's the cabbage crop in the fall. And yeah, we got good yields from that as well. So that's sort of the rye sequence in a nutshell. Any questions on that before I go to the summer mix?
There's a couple of things in the chat. Richard is asking, have you thought about or tried a tennis court or lawn roller in regards to the crimping process? And there's another here. Have you tried using a water wheel transplanter? Right.
Yeah. So no, I didn't know about a lawn roller or tennis court roller. I'm not sure what that looks like. We did try to use a rolling dibble, a homemade rolling dibble, which is basically just a 55-gallon drum that I stuck an axle through and a handle. And it wasn't heavy enough. That would be my concern with anything rollable that a human can push, is it's not going to be heavy enough to crimp that rye or to really knock it down effectively. Because when two people are stepping on that T-post, we're like stomping it in unison. So there's probably, a few hundred pounds of force going down on that steel edge of the T-post every foot as we stomp it down the bed. So I think that would be hard to mimic with anything rolling, that unless you get the full-on sort of tractor roller crimper that does that effectively. So that would be my answer for that one. Have I used a water wheel transplanter? No. So we have a little tractor for moving compost around and moving heavy materials around, but it never drives on the fields. We're completely human scale in the fields, aside from that little walk behind BCS tractor I showed earlier. So the riding tractor never goes in the fields. And because of that, we're able to grow sort of very intensively and do things that we couldn't do if we were sort of based on tractor implements. So no, I haven't tried the water wheel transplanter. I imagine it might have trouble going through that rye, but I haven't actually tried it. I feel like from other things I've heard, you need some sort of modified equipment to transplant through this kind of mulch. And I think there's a lot of research happening on that now, but I don't know much about it.
Al is wondering if there's hand weeding done in this crop, and Jane is wondering if you have varieties of peas and oats. And sorry to pile this on, but Maybell is wondering when you sow, what's the sow date of, I believe, of your cover crop?
Sure. So first, hand weeding. Yes, this needs to be weeded by hand. You can't even hoe because of the straw mulch. So that's something to consider. If you have really weedy ground, this is not going to be a solution to that. This is going to, that will provide challenges. So I would say try to use this once your weed situation is under control, once you don't have a huge weed pressure. Yeah, or yeah, and there's different strategies to, you know, reduce your weed seed bank, and I would say not tilling is a big one of those. But if you have really weedy ground and the weeds come up through this straw mulch, that can be a real pain, because you have to basically pull weeds by hand in this model. And we've gotten to the point where we have very low weed pressure by not tilling ever. We're not stirring up new weed seed. By leaving the straw mulch in place and not tilling, there's even less. And then what does come up, we just pull by hand very meticulously, so there's nothing ever, no new seed dropping. So we pulled maybe a few dozen weeds from this whole plot the whole season. And that's again because we've been doing this for years without tilling and really managing our weeds. So I wouldn't recommend, if you have really weedy ground, maybe, you know, start with winter killed cover crops, peas and oats, and then, you know, maybe build in some tarping to help manage those weeds and keep them from dropping seed for a season or two before you start trying this method. What was the other question?
The variety of peas and oats, and a clarification, Maybell is wondering when you sow the peas and oats.
Right. So the variety, just any field pea cover crop seed. Johnny's again is my go-to for that. Same as oats, any kind of cover crop oats, or you know, culinary oats, but those tend to be a little more expensive. So yeah, not picky with the varieties of peas and oats. But seeding date would be by, in our climate, again, zone 4B, where September 1st is sort of the latest date I would ever sow peas and oats. After that, it stops really being worth it because they won't be very tall by the time they winter kill. And so, yeah, September 1st, and then for rye, it's October 1st. You get an extra month because rye grows so well into the cold.
And your spring planting of oats and peas?
Yeah, peas and oats as soon as possible in the spring, as soon as the ground thaws, as soon as you can get out on it. So for us, that's usually sometime in April, early, mid, sometimes late April. Yeah, I mean, you can, you know, seed peas and oats later too, but they tend to do better in cool weather. So, you know, seeding them in June probably wouldn't make as much sense as a different cover crop that likes the heat more. Any others, or shall I move on?
That's it for now.
Cool. So yeah, speaking of crops that like the heat, talk about summer cover crops. And I want to say a little bit about just building diversity into cover cropping too, because it's very easy to just sort of stick with, you know, peas and oats, winter rye, or buckwheat in the summer, and not to really do much more diversity than that. But adding diversity has really been shown to like do a lot for soil health. You know, different plants associate differently with the soil microorganisms. So the more types of plants you have, the more diversity you'll have below ground as well. And just the more resilience in that soil ecosystem. So yeah, I started experimenting with that and sort of took it to the extreme here. So this is an extreme example, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend going this far, but this was a 14 different species all mixed together. I just basically took every heat-loving cover crop species I could get my hands on and mixed it in and seeded it in a whole plot, which was fun and educational. But I would say in hindsight, maybe stick with like 4 to 5 at the most, or even 3 or 4, and because with each new species you add, there's sort of a little bit of diminishing returns on the diversity benefit, but also increasing management challenges, because they might all have different, you know, different heights, different flowering times, different times at which they set seed, different winter hardinesses. So yeah, managing that mix becomes more and more challenging. So here's an example of a challenging 14 species mix that I wouldn't do again quite the same way. So here's all the seed. I got it mostly from greencoverseed.com, which is actually a great site because you can order a whole wide variety of cover crop seed by the pound instead of having to get like full 5-pound or 10-pound or 50-pound bags. You can just sort of custom order as little as 1 pound at a time, which is fun to make your own cocktail, if you will. So yeah, I grouped the seed into 3 sizes, separated them into 3 sizes and used 3 different seeding plates on the earthway seeder again. And this is what it looked like. Again, we have relatively weed-free beds that we, have put a lot of work into keeping that way. And so I'm able to do this and not just have a huge flush of weeds come up. Again, without tilling too, there's, what weed seed there is probably pretty well buried at this point and doesn't germinate. So yeah, this is this mix coming up. I seeded it very thickly, which was too thick in hindsight, but it did cover the soil very quickly. And yeah, so here's the mix. I guess I just used two different seed plates: the beet plate, sorghum, Sudan grass, cowpeas, sun hemp, mung beans, buckwheat, sunflower, safflower, and cilantro. Radish plate, bursum clover, crimson clover, 2 types of millet, forage turnip, and sweet alyssum. So notice there's some like smaller flowering plants in there too for beneficial insects, as well as the sort of grasses and legumes typical of cover crops. Oh, so my slides were out of order here. So here's the, after we seeded it, that's what it looks like, just the earthway. You see the grooves where the earthway seeder went through. Again, we irrigate it just like any other crop, make sure it germinates well. And then it came up and it covered the soil very quickly. And then you can see that buckwheat, as it's known for, that's this broad-leafed, taller plant, is sort of winning the race, crowding out some of the other plants. So that was one thing I would change. I'd probably do much less buckwheat, or maybe even leave the buckwheat out of the mix, because the buckwheat also flowered well before anything else. So then I had to go through and scythe it. But you can see, I mean, if you look at that cover crop, and all the different organisms in it, you can really appreciate this is sort of the natural method of feeding the soil. The diversity, the photosynthesis, the soil coverage, and the lack of disturbance here will lead to just really healthy soil. So yeah, since it was flowering, I was concerned about the buckwheat dropping seed and becoming a weed seed problem. Having buckwheat coming up the next year in our lettuce mix, for instance. So I scythed it at sort of knee height. That's what it looked like afterwards. And then, everything else regrew really well. And I had to scythe it a few more times because there were so many species in the mix, and they all started, starting to produce seed at different times. So again, in hindsight, I'd stick with like 4 or 5 staple cover crops for the summer mix. But yeah, and then it regrew. And yeah, eventually all of these are heat-loving crops. They don't survive the winter. So eventually just winter killed. And this year we just planted right through the stubble left from it. And because I scythed it, I kept scything it, all of that was creating this thick. So this year, is this sort of beautiful, thickly mulched stubble left over that we could just transplant right through, or if we needed to direct seed, we can rake the mulch into the pathways like I showed with the peas and oats, and direct seed right into it. So yeah, thinking about making your own mix, there's There's all different goals you might have for cover cropping. You know, they break up compaction, they suppress weeds, they suppress pests and disease. You know, certain cover crops in the brassica family can actually, you know, suppress nematode pests. They've actually been used as natural sort of fumigants for the soil, if you want to go that way. They can fix nitrogen, they can fix carbon. You know, all plants fix carbon through photosynthesis, but some do better than others, and really build up a lot of biomass. They can scavenge minerals by sending their roots, you know, deep down, deeper than vegetables would typically go, and you know, bring up minerals to the surface, so that then when they die, those minerals are available to shallower rooted crops. Yeah, they can flower or exude sap and feed beneficial insects. They can produce forage for livestock. They can create these grown in place mulches like I've shown. And then, yeah, all the considerations you want to think about when putting together a cocktail is the different plant heights. You know, are some going to outcompete others, or yeah, start to compete with your crop if you're undersowing? How compatible are they with other crops in the mix? Like, do they have the same winter kill temperatures, or are some going to survive the winter and others will winter kill? You know, all things to think about. What time do they flower? How do they complete their life cycle? Some cover crops are biennials instead of annuals. Some are perennial, and you want to think about, you know, how are you going to terminate those eventually? So it kind of makes sense to group cover crops with similar traits, so that they're easier to manage, and you're not managing like 5 different categories of cover crop all in one mix. Yeah, and how easy are they to terminate? Peas and oats go really well together because they both winter kill about the same temperature. They're both very easy to terminate, even if they don't winter kill. You know, if you plant them in the spring, they're just a very good pair. That's why they're grouped together. Yeah. So I'm not going to read through all this, but you'll have it in the slideshow if you want. These are all sort of examples of legume cover crops, their approximate winter kill temperature, and their typical maximum height. So you can start to see, you know, how you might group certain crops together. So these are legumes. I assume most people know this, but legumes have the unique ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere with a symbiotic process with certain bacteria in their roots. So they can actually pull not just carbon out of the air, but also nitrogen out of the air. Our air is mostly nitrogen, and they can put that right into the soil. So they can replace the need for imported nitrogen fertilizer. And a good cover crop can actually supply all the nitrogen you need for your next crop. There's, you know, if done well, this can entirely replace nitrogen fertilizer. So those are legumes. These are grasses and forbs. So forbs are sort of broadleaf plants that aren't grasses or legumes. So yeah, common forbs are buckwheat or forage radish, sometimes called tillage radish. It's really great at breaking up compaction. So yeah, you can see all the different temperatures that they typically die at in the winter, how tall they get, and you can see, you know, how you might group certain ones together and kind of experiment with those. I like to, you know, one of my favorite fall crops is barley, because it grows, you can see its winter kill temperature is closer to 0 degrees, whereas oats dies around 15. So the barley will grow longer into the fall than oats will, and you know, produce a little more biomass than just oats would. Annual ryegrass would be a great winter kill cover crop if I were a little bit farther north, but -10 is kind of right on the edge of maybe it won't winter kill, and then it would come back in the spring and be a problem. But if I were one zone further north, that would probably be a safer bet to use annual ryegrass. So yeah, grasses, forbs, and legumes. Those are sort of the 3 categories. And really, you can kind of simplify it and say 3 is a party. If you have one of each of those categories, that's a very nice, diverse mix. So a grass plus a legume plus a forb. And this is not new. This is, you know, indigenous knowledge. If you've heard of the 3 sisters, that's, you know, corn, beans, and squash. That's a grass, a legume, and a forb. So, you know, this was well understood for thousands of years. So here are some sample cocktails. For, again, we're in zone 4B. And I think, yeah, I apologize for the humor here, but we have the winter sour. That's maybe oats, field peas, bell beans, tillage radish, crimson clover, and cilantro. Those will all winter sour or die in winter. They will winter kill in the cold of winter. So that might be a nice combination for a fall mix. Then there's the summer soiler maker. These are all heat-loving crops that grow really well in the heat. Sorghum Sudan, millet, buckwheat, sun hemp, cowpeas, sweet alyssum as the understory flowering crop. If I made this before I know everything I know now, I might take the buckwheat out of there. Maybe I'd even take the millet out of there. And just, to ease the danger of things going to seed. And then the overwintery mix, we have winter rye, might throw some barley in there. Vetch, Austrian winter pea is a really cold hardy winter pea that will survive, I think, down to about -10, 0 to -10, somewhere in there. Then you could even stick mammoth red clover and tillage radish. And notice not all of those are going to overwinter. Like tillage radish will die, but enough of them will overwinter that they will just fill in its place in the spring and actually, you know, feed off of its fertility that it's leaving behind when it dies. So those are just sort of examples of cocktails that are getting, you know, more than just 1 or 2 cover crops in the mix. So yeah, the more diversity there is, the more niches get filled. If you notice on the right, this is the same seeding density, but 2 different crops. There's peas and oats, versus on the left, you know, the same seeding density overall, but is just oats. And the peas and oats, you can see how much better soil coverage there is. You can also imagine those peas are fixing nitrogen, and there's just more diversity there. Better soil coverage, more photosynthesis relative to the pure oat stand. So I think this is really true as you go from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, maybe as you go from 3 to 4 and beyond that, it's sort of diminishing returns. And then your management challenges start to increase too, the more species you have. So I'd sort of recommend, 3 to 4, you know, start with a grass, a legume, and a forb. And that's a solid foundational cover crop cocktail right there. But you can always, you know, add a 4th or 5th if you want. So yeah, here's a fall cocktail we did of oats, barley, fava beans, field peas, crimson clover, and daikon radish. So the one exception to keeping it really simple is if you just pick species that will all winter kill, it's kind of a safe bet because they're all going to die in winter. So no matter what happens, you know, it'll all die and be ready to plant the next spring. So yeah, we threw a lot in this mix and it did wonderfully. This is opening up a new plot. So we started by growing a fall cover crop. And this plot is doing great this year. We opened it up last fall. So then real quick, not necessarily have to do with cover crops, but I think cover crops can really allow you to integrate livestock more easily into a vegetable production. So here's how we do that. There's all these reasons to do that. You can stack your enterprises symbiotically. So the same land can support multiple, you know, business enterprises and that can support each other. It's a great way to increase diversity. Livestock, you know, a healthy soil ecosystem does not exist that doesn't have animals as part of it. Even, you know, even if you're vegan, there's all sorts of animals in any kind of terrestrial ecosystem that's thriving. So then, and yeah, it can activate biology through the, you know, all the internal biology of the animals gets spread on the land, along with nutrients. You can use animals to mow or manage the cover crops instead of machinery, and you can diversify your markets and revenue and add customer appeal. So all these reasons to integrate livestock as part of your cover cropping plan. Here's some sheep enjoying some peas and oats. This is another example that we've done pretty extensively, is in the fall. On our fall cover crop, here's a mix of, it looks like peas, oats, and tillage radish. And you see all the turkeys in the background there about to move on to it. And here they are moving on to it. So the turkeys love cover crops. They're actually really great grazers. They eat it right down. And this is next year's fertility. All this photosynthesis, the legumes are fixing nitrogen, and then we're adding even more fertility by running the turkeys over it, and they're, you know, adding their biology and their manure. And then all those nutrients get soaked up right into the roots of the cover crop and held in place until the next spring when we plant in them. So yeah, this is sort of the complete package of natural fertility, if you will, that I think works amazingly well, rather than just, you know, going to buy a bag of fish meal or whatever have you and import it.
And Daniel.
Yes.
That might be a nice segue to one of the questions. Richard is wondering about your overall fertility program. Any compost application, minerals that you can mention, and then how they're worked in and when with your cover cropping program.
Totally. Yeah. So I do soil testing each year, and I will add, you know, sort of a custom blend of fertilizer and amendments based on that soil test. And I will try to add it before the cover crop gets seeded. So it's getting taken up by the cover crop most likely, and then held and released for the cash crop the next year. So it's every plot is different at this point because it's based on what's been grown there and what's been applied there in the past. So I rely on soil tests pretty heavily to determine what to apply. Typically, I will apply a little bit of nitrogen and a little bit of potassium, and maybe some trace minerals, but at this point, those are pretty well built up. In the early years, I used a lot of compost. And that was before I did, you know, custom fertilizers. I just used a lot of compost, and that was it. So that's really built up most of my nutrient needs. Phosphorus is actually too high because of that. And organic matter is very high as well, in the double digits. So yeah, I don't know if that answers that fully, but in terms of working it in, we just spread it on top and give it a light rake, and then seed the cover crop right over that.
Laura was wondering the spacing on your beds. This question came when you showed the winter mix.
The spacing on the beds. Yeah, so they're 5 feet on center. So from the center of one bed to the center of the next is 5 feet, which our paths are about 18 inches. So that leaves about 42 inches of bed width.
Problems with hairy veg, peas, and oats not killing in the winter? Any ideas?
Yeah, I've actually steered clear of vetch for like up until now. This is the first season that I'm going to be experimenting with vetch because I'm worried about it, you know, being able to kill it because it has those you know, extensive network of rhizomes, which I'm worried that the tarp won't kill effectively. But I'm going to experiment with it. But yeah, I would say if you're nervous about vetch, maybe leave that out. But peas and oats, up here in Maine anyway, reliably winter kill. So yeah, maybe start with those and then start experimenting with more of the overwintered cover crops after that.
Someone's asking about your soil test calendar.
Yeah, so I try to test around now, ideally, so that I get the results back in time to apply those amendments in the fall before cover crops get seeded.
Can chickens be used instead of turkeys?
Great question. So I have tried using layers instead of turkeys. And the problem with that is that layers love to scratch up and dust bathe and sort of till the soil. So they will probably flatten any kind of raised beds you have and disturb the soil much more than turkeys or meat chickens would. If you have meat chickens, they work great. And layers can work if you have a really thick established cover crop that holds the soil in place. But even if you leave them too long, they start to really do some damage to the soil. So I love layers. You know, we had 600 layers at one point. We raised a lot of hens, but they are pretty tough on the land. But yeah, certainly integrating them in low numbers and moving them quickly, I think can be great.
Can you clarify your seed spacing for cover crops?
Oh, the seed spacing. Yeah, so I use the earthway seeder, and that determines the the spacing because the different plates put down seeds at different rates. So I use the beet plate for most seeds, grasses, most of the bigger seeds, and then I use the carrot plate for the smaller seeds like clover and alyssum and yeah, the smaller seeds.
And the row spacing?
And then we do 12 rows per bed, per 42-inch bed.
Wow.
So pretty thick. Yeah, the goal is to really get that soil covered quickly and have a real thick stand of cover crop.
Judy is asking when to plant, I may butcher this, Phacelia.
Oh, Phacelia. Yeah, I threw that in my summer mix, but honestly, it got choked out by all the other 13 species in there. So I don't know much about Phacelia. I would just recommend researching that. Sorry. Cool. Well, that's the end. I can keep taking questions. But I also wanted to do a shameless plug for my upcoming book coming out in November. If any of this is of interest to you, I'd recommend checking it out. I put a lot of work into it, so hopefully it's useful to folks. But yeah, happy to take any other questions too.
Fantastic. Is that a Chelsea Green publication?
It's actually Story Publishing.
Story Publishing. Uh-huh.
So yeah, I should have put a link on here, but it's available for pre-order through anywhere you buy books, I guess. But yeah, it's coming out in early November.
Great, congratulations on that.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybell's asking if you can use eating peas for the spring cover crop.
Like snap peas or
yeah,
shell peas. You could. I think that would be fine. They tend to be much more expensive seeds, but if you already have a bunch left over from something, yeah, I would say why not.
I think we're caught up on questions. How do you seed fava bean?
Yeah, so we use the jumbo pea plate on the earthway seeder for fava beans because they're really big. So yeah, they get a separate seed plate. Yeah, and we set the depth on the seeder a little deeper too, since they're such a big seed.
Yeah, we're caught up on questions at the moment.
Nice. Well, how much time do we have left?
Well, you're really efficient. It's great. It's a 5:25.
Nice. 5 minutes to spare. Well,
Yeah.
Certainly we can come up with something to talk about.
I echo many of the sentiments. There's many folks that enjoyed this presentation. I echo that as well. It was very well thought out, and the pace was very nice.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's sometimes hard to tell when I'm just staring at the computer, so I appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah, so if there's any last minute questions someone wants to drop in the chat, we can take another one. I'm going to put some other links in there. I'll share the link to the PowerPoint folder that will house presenter PowerPoints overall. So Daniel's PowerPoint will appear in there soon, so you'll be able to access it there.
Jason,
Yes.
could you say that again? How to access the PowerPoint?
We're starting to share a link to a Google folder where all of the PowerPoints that presenters are sharing with us will be housed.
Fabulous.
I'll share the link to the overall folder, and you can find them in there. We don't have everyone's in there, but we're trying to get as many as possible.
Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Yeah, it seems it seems everyone's very satisfied. I think we're in really good shape. That was a fantastic presentation. Your farm's gorgeous, and the towering cover crops are just so inspiring and impressive. Really, I mean, to see them 6 feet tall and you're managing them. It's like wild, but it's concise in that you have a very orderly.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the goal of the kind of farming I do. I guess wild but concise. That's a good description for it.
Yeah. It looks someone's not getting a question answered here. Would you get peas to eat from the cover crop though? I think she's asking, would it be too thickly seeded to yield peas?
Oh yeah. So we typically don't eat the peas because we want to terminate it. We terminate it before then. Plus cover crop peas might not taste as good, but we do harvest and eat and sell the pea tendrils. So that top portion of the plant, we actually, make a pretty good earning from those. Just break off the tops of each pea plant as it's growing in the cover crop, and we sell those for $15 a pound. So they taste just like sweet peas, and really delicate and delicious in the early spring, or one of the earliest crops that's ready for us. So yeah, you can eat your cover crop too.
Yeah, stacking enterprises.
Right.
Do you have, you showed us turkeys, you showed us, did I recall a sheep or a goat?
Yep, we used to raise sheep. We used to raise pigs. Actually, this year we're taking a break from all livestock.
Oh, really?
Other than human livestock, because my partner and I just had a child last year, or 2 years ago now. So decided to focus on the human livestock for now, because the animals can be a lot of work, a lot of extra management and stress when there are predators. So just trying to simplify our lives a little bit. So this is the first year we're not raising any livestock. But yeah, in the past we raised, sheep, pigs, turkeys, meat chickens, and laying hens, all at once.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on the human livestock that you're raising.
Thanks.
What was the publisher's name one more time?
Story Publishing, Storey. Or you can just, Google the No-Till Organic Vegetable Farm. That's the title of the book. It's on Amazon or wherever for pre-order. Or I imagine once it comes out, I'll be posting. Also, if you want to follow us on Instagram at Frith Farm, FRITHFARM. I can put that in the chat too.
Yeah, please do.
I try to post fairly regularly there, like our different methods and what we're experimenting with. And then I'll also post, reminders that the book's coming out and stuff like that. There's also our website that I put in the chat that you can sign up to be on our email list, or just read more about the farm if you're interested. And certainly stop on by anytime you're in the area. Love to have visitors.
Yeah, fantastic. I put the book link in the chat.
Nice.
And you're welcome to put the Instagram in there.
Yeah, I think I put it to privately, so sorry about that. Here it is again.
All right.
There's the Instagram and the website.
Great. I want to let everyone know that just right next to where you type into the chat, there's 3 dots, and you can click on the 3 dots and then save this chat, and it will save all of the information in the chat to your computer. It's a handy little resource there. So just to the right of where you type into the chat, there's 3 dots. Click that and you will see an option to save the chat. Very enjoyable, Daniel. Thank you very much. Good luck with your book. I hope everyone here will pick it up as well. And very much a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Fun to see you. Be with you virtually.
Yeah.
Happy growing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Have a great season.